I spent 22 years with the Michigan State Police before I retired, and in that time, I saw things that most people only read about in newspapers. Domestic violence calls that ended in ways nobody planned. Fatal accidents on black ice where you had to keep moving because stopping meant falling apart. I've pulled bodies out of the Osable River in April when the water was still cold enough to take your breath away, talked men down from ledges on highway overpasses at 3 in the morning, worked triple homicides in towns where everyone knew everyone and nobody wanted to believe what their neighbor had done. I've responded to industrial accidents in the middle of winter nights, documented crime scenes in temperatures so cold the ink in your pen stopped working, delivered death notifications to families who were still asleep when I knocked on their door and who would never sleep quite the same way again after I left. I have seen what human beings are capable of doing to each other, and I have seen what the natural world does to people who underestimate it, and none of it broke me. None of it changed the way I moved through the world in any fundamental sense. I adapted, the way you do in that line of work, and I kept going. And I believed that after 22 years of that kind of experience, there was very little left that could genuinely reach past my training and touch something older and more basic inside me. I was wrong about that. I've been wrong about that every day since October 14th, 2009. And I expect I will continue to be wrong about it for whatever years I've left. What happened on a 2-track logging road 11 miles east of Grayling on that particular night is something I have never fully described to anyone. Not to my wife, not to my doctor, not to the department psychologist I saw twice afterward before deciding that the sessions were doing more harm than good because I couldn't tell her the truth about what I was actually processing. I'm telling it now because I'm 63 years old, and I've spent 15 years carrying something that gets heavier rather than lighter, and I've reached the point where the carrying costs more than the telling. I want you to understand before I start that I know how this sounds. I knew how it would sound the night it happened, sitting in that cruiser with the engine idling and the spotlight cutting across the tree line, and knowing how it sounds did not change what I was seeing. My partner that night was Keith Dabrowski. Keith had 19 years with the department when it happened, the last 11 of them working rural Crawford County out of the Grayling Post. He was the kind of officer you wanted beside you on a difficult call, methodical and calm, and possessed of the particular steadiness that comes not from being unafraid but from having learned to work alongside fear without letting it drive. He had a wife and 2 daughters and a hunting cabin near Lovells that he'd spent 3 years building on weekends, and he was planning to retire at the 25-year mark and spend his mornings fishing the north branch of the Osable. I don't know what Keith's plans are now. We haven't spoken since the spring of 2010. What I know is that he transferred to administrative processing 6 weeks after that October night, and that he put in his retirement papers before the year was out, and that the man I saw briefly at a department function in March of 2010 looked like a man who had stopped sleeping in any meaningful way. I recognized that look because I was wearing it myself. I still wear traces of it, if I'm being honest, on the mornings when the dreams are bad. We were running a routine patrol that evening, rural route coverage in Crawford County, checking on seasonal cabins, logging access roads, looking for signs of poaching activity or vandalism in those weeks before the deer season crowds came in from downstate. The national forest out there is dense and old, mostly jack pine and mixed hardwoods with stands of birch along the creek drainages, and in mid-October, before the leaves have fully dropped, it holds the darkness in a way that cities and suburbs don't prepare you for. The darkness out there has depth to it. It has layers. The spotlight we ran from the cruiser could push a good beam, but it never felt like it was reaching all the way to the back of what was out there. And after enough years working those roads at night, you stopped thinking about that consciously and just accepted it as a condition of the environment. The temperature had fallen to 38 degrees by 10 o'clock, and the sky was clear and hard with stars over the open stretches between the tree canopy. Keith was driving. I had the spotlight out the passenger window, sweeping it slow and steady across the brush and the road shoulders the way we always did on that stretch. We weren't talking much. That's the thing about long partnerships and enough difficult years worked alongside the same person. You stop filling the silence just to fill it. The quiet between you becomes its own kind of language, and that night the language it was speaking, before either of us said a word about it, was that something was different. The first thing I noticed was the deer. or more precisely, the absence of them. There should have been deer along that road. There almost always were in the weeks before the season, when the animals had grown accustomed to the relative quiet and were feeding heavily along the road edges in the evenings and into the night. Keith and I had run that particular two-track enough times over the years that we'd come to think of certain spots almost as landmarks, places where you could reliably expect to see eyes catching the light, or the white flag of a tail disappearing into the brush, or a doe standing broadside in the road ahead with that particular expression of mild inconvenience they get when the headlights find them. That night, we saw nothing. Not in the first mile, not in the second, not in the third. No eyes reflecting back from the brush on either side. No movement in the undergrowth, no tracks fresh enough to catch the light in the soft shoulder. Just empty road and still trees, and an absence that I registered below the level of articulate thought, the way your body sometimes arrives at a conclusion before your mind has constructed the question that leads to it. Keith mentioned it first, said it quietly and without much inflection, the way a careful man says something he isn't entirely certain he should say. He said something about tonight, feeling different out here. I didn't respond. I kept the light moving, but I had already felt it. We were close to 3 miles in when the radio dropped. Dead zones were common enough in that corridor between the relay infrastructure, and I had worked in them before without giving it much thought. This felt different from a standard dead zone. There was a quality to the static, a particular texture to the silence underneath it when I keyed the handset and got nothing useful back that sat wrong with me in a way I could not immediately name. I ran through the standard checks. The equipment appeared functional. Keith slowed the cruiser to a near stop without me asking him to, let it roll almost to a standstill while I worked the radio. He had felt the same thing I had. That shift in the quality of the night that you learn to take seriously after enough years in the field, after enough situations where paying attention early meant the difference between a story you tell later and a statistic someone else tells about you. It wasn't panic. It wasn't anything that dramatic. It was simply the accumulated weight of experience pressing up against something it didn't recognize, something it didn't have a prior model for, and registering that fact as a quiet and serious alarm. Then, we smelled it. Both of us at what felt like the same instant, because Keith brought the cruiser to a complete stop without either of us saying a word, and we sat there with the engine idling and the heater fan running, and neither of us reached for a door handle. It was an animal smell, but heavy and wrong in a way that went past identification and landed somewhere more primitive. Not the musky sweetness of deer, not the sharp ammonia edge of coyote or fox, not bear, which has its own particular quality that you learn after enough time in northern Michigan. This was heavier and denser and wetter than any of those, like something biological and large that had been in the dark and the warmth for too long. The closest description I've ever managed is wet dog, and I've heard other people who've experienced similar things reach for the same words, but wet dog doesn't account for what was underneath it, a lower register of smell that I can only describe as ancient, as though it carried information about something that had been alive and predatory for much longer than the things I was accustomed to smelling in those woods. It came through the ventilation system and settled in the back of the throat and the roof of the mouth, and no amount of swallowing got rid of it. Keith rolled his window up without discussing it. I had already closed mine. We sat still, and we listened. The engine ticked as engines do when they're running at low idle. The heater fan moved air through the vents. Beyond those two sounds, there was nothing, and I want to be precise about what I mean by nothing, because I've spent 15 years trying to describe it accurately, and it matters. It was not the ordinary quiet of a rural night in mid-October. There were no insects, which was reasonable for the temperature, but there were no other small sounds either. No leaves moving in any wind, no branch settling under its own weight, no small animals moving through the leaf litter on either side of the road. The silence had a physical quality, a density to it, like the air had changed its composition and become something that pressed gently but persistently against your eardrums. I have stood on frozen lakes in January at 2 a.m. when the world has gone entirely to ice and cold. I have been in the deep forest at 3 a.m. in December with a foot of snow on the ground and everything living buried or dormant beneath it. None of those silences felt like this one. Those silences were empty. This one was occupied. This silence had been made by something that was holding itself completely and deliberately still in the darkness just beyond the edge of where we could see, and it was holding itself still because it had decided to, and it was waiting to see what we would do before it decided what came next. I had my hand on the door handle. I became aware of that fact without remembering having moved my hand there. Keith put his forearm across the console between us, a quiet and unhurried gesture, and I left my hand where it was, but I did not open the door. We sat there for another interval that my memory insists was longer than my watch would have confirmed. Then the spotlight, which I had left angled toward the left shoulder of the road when we stopped, caught something at the tree line. 40 yards ahead of us, possibly a little more, standing at the boundary between the light and the shadow that the jack pines made beyond it. My mind's first attempt was to make it into a snag, a dead tree still standing, something vertical that belonged to the landscape and had a reasonable explanation. That attempt failed immediately and completely. Whatever was standing at the edge of that tree line was not part of the landscape. The proportions were wrong from the first fraction of a second in a way that registered as wrongness before I had time to begin cataloging specifics. Too tall, too broad through the shoulders, and the shoulders carried too high, and the head set between them in a way that communicated a different underlying architecture than anything I had a name for. A body organized around principles that were not the principles I was accustomed to reading in the field. I held the light on it. I don't remember deciding to hold the light on it. Training does things without consulting you. It did not move. It stood at the boundary of the light and the shadow with a stillness that living things of that mass do not generally maintain. A stillness that itself communicated something, communicated patience and awareness and the particular quality of an entity that is chosen to be still rather than one that simply happens to be standing in place. And then, after a period of that stillness, it turned its head. Slightly. Carefully. The way a person turns their head when they are in the middle of making a decision and want to take in a piece of information before they finish making it. In the edge of the spotlight, for just a moment, I saw the eyes catch the light and return it, amber and flat and utterly level, positioned at a height above the road surface that I did not want to calculate, because calculating it would have meant accepting what I was already beginning to understand. My mouth had gone dry in the way it goes dry when the body is doing things in preparation for what might come next and has diverted resources away from anything it considers non-essential. The hand I had resting on the door handle had gone cold inside my glove, and I was grateful, in a way that bypassed language entirely, that I had not opened that door. Keith put the cruiser in reverse. He did it slowly and without any sudden movement, the way you move when you've been in enough situations where sudden movement was the wrong choice and your body has absorbed that lesson completely. He didn't gun the engine. He didn't spin the tires. He just eased the transmission into reverse and began backing up along the two-track at a speed that felt almost insultingly calm, given what was standing 40 yards ahead of us in the edge of the spotlight. I kept the light on it. I don't know why exactly. Some combination of not wanting to look away from it and the operational logic that told me maintaining visual contact with a potential threat was preferable to losing it in the dark. The thing at the tree line did not move while we backed up. It stood there with that same deliberate stillness and watched us go, and the watching had a quality to it that I have never been able to adequately describe to anyone who wasn't there. It wasn't the passive observation of an animal caught in unexpected light. It was assessment. It was the specific, focused attention of something that was processing what it was seeing and deciding what it meant and what, if anything, it was going to do about it. We backed up for close to 200 yards before Keith found a spot wide enough to turn the cruiser around without putting us into the ditch. He did the turn in 3 careful movements, keeping the headlights angled so we maintained some visibility on the road ahead, and when we were pointed back the way we had come, he drove at an even and deliberate pace for the first quarter mile. Neither of us spoke. I had the spotlight off by then, and I was watching the right side mirror, watching the darkness behind us the way you watch something you're not entirely sure has stayed where you left it. The road curved, and the spot where we had stopped disappeared behind the tree line, and I kept watching the mirror for another full minute after that, past the point where seeing anything in it would have been possible. Then Keith exhaled, a long and controlled breath, and I realized I had been holding mine. He said, "Did you see the height of it?" That was all he said. Not "what was that?" or "I don't believe it," or any of the things a person might reasonably say in that situation. Just the height. Because the height was the thing that had gotten past both of our defenses, the thing that made every alternative explanation collapse before you could finish constructing it. I told him yes. I told him I had seen the height. We drove the rest of the way out to the county road without speaking again. And when we reached the pavement, Keith stopped the cruiser and sat with his hands on the wheel and the engine running for almost 2 full minutes before he pulled out onto the asphalt and turned us back toward Grayling. We called it in. I want to be honest about that because I've thought about it many times since, about whether we should have done something differently in those immediate hours. We called it in as a possible wildlife encounter, large animal, unknown species, on the 2-track east of the state forest boundary. The sergeant on duty that night asked us a few questions in the flat and practical tone that desk sergeants use when they're trying to determine whether a call is going to require them to do anything. And when we couldn't tell him with any clarity what species we were reporting, he told us to document it, and he'd flag it for the DNR Wildlife Division in the morning. There was a pause after Keith finished the call, a pause where I think we both understood that the documentation we were about to write would not come close to describing what we had actually seen, and that the DNR Wildlife Division was not the agency that was going to have an answer for us. We went back out there the next morning. That was my idea, and I've questioned it many times since, not because of what we found, but because of what finding it did to the already unsteady ground we were both trying to stand on. We went in daylight with a second cruiser and 2 other officers who we told only that we'd had an unusual wildlife encounter and wanted to document the site. The 2-track looked different in the morning light, the way places always look different when the sun is on them and the darkness that changed them is gone. It looked ordinary. It looked like every other 2-track in Crawford County, rutted and leaf-strewn and flanked by jack pine that stood indifferent to whatever had happened among them the night before. We found the spot without difficulty. I had marked the mileage on the odometer, and Keith remembered the curve and the particular grouping of birch trees on the right shoulder that had been in our headlights when we stopped. The tracks were there. That was the first thing, the tracks in the soft verge on the left side of the road where the ground was damp from a drainage that ran beneath the 2-track through a culvert. One of the other officers, a younger man named Paulson, who had maybe 4 years on the job, crouched down beside the clearest impression and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he looked up at me and I looked back at him, and neither of us said what we were both reading in that print. It was canine in its basic structure, in the pad arrangement and the claw marks at the leading edge of each toe. But the size was wrong. The stride was wrong. And the depth of the impression in ground that the other officer's boot was barely marking told its own story about the weight that had made it. There were places where the track pattern shifted, where the spacing and the pressure distribution changed in a way that Paulson studied for a long time, before he stood up and walked to a different section of the verge and studied that too. He didn't explain what he was reading there. He didn't have to. The pattern was clear enough if you knew what bipedal locomotion looked like in soft ground and how it differed from the 4-point pattern on either side of it. We found the bark damage on a jack pine at the tree line, roughly where the thing had been standing. The gouges were at a height that required the tallest of us to reach above his head to touch the lower edge of them. They were deep, cutting through the outer bark and into the cambium beneath in parallel lines that had the mechanical quality of something done with controlled force rather than frantic scratching. There was no blood. There was no fur caught in the rough bark below the gouges. There was only the damage itself and the smell, faint in the cold morning air, but still present, still carrying that particular lower register that I had noticed the night before, that quality I could not name, and still cannot name. One of the officers walked back to his cruiser after a few minutes and waited there. He didn't explain why. Paulson photographed everything with his department camera and wrote something in his notebook and didn't share what he'd written. Keith stood at the tree line and looked into the forest for a long time with his hands in his jacket pockets and an expression on his face that I recognized because it was the same expression I could feel on my own. The photographs went into a file. The file went somewhere in the departmental system, and I never saw it referenced again in any briefing or report. I made inquiries about it twice in the following months and was told both times that the wildlife report had been forwarded to the appropriate agency and was pending review. The second time I asked, the lieutenant I spoke with held my gaze for a moment before he answered, and there was something in that pause that told me clearly and without words that asking a third time would not be in my interest. I did not ask a third time. What followed in the weeks and months after that night was the slow process of understanding that something had changed in me, in a way that was not going to change back. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself all at once. It was more like discovering a crack in a foundation, something structural and fundamental that you notice in small ways at first, in the way a door doesn't hang quite right anymore, in the way certain sounds carry differently through the rooms. I started sleeping badly, waking in the 3 o'clock hour with the specific and sourceless conviction that something outside was aware of me, which is an irrational thing to feel in a suburban neighborhood in Grayling with a porch light and a dog and 22 years of professional experience that should have argued against it. The dog was the first thing I noticed changing in the autumn after that night. She was a 7-year-old shepherd mix named Bess who had been calm and settled her entire life, and starting that winter, she began refusing to go into the backyard after dark. She would stand at the sliding door and look out at the yard and the darkness beyond the fence, and she would not go through the door regardless of what I did. She never growled. She never barked. She simply looked out at whatever she was looking at and declined, with a kind of quiet and absolute certainty, to go any further. I retired at the 22-year mark instead of the 25 I had planned on. I told my wife it was the right time, and I told myself the same thing, and there was enough truth in it to make the telling feel honest. The pension was reasonable. We had savings. The timing made sense on paper. But the fuller truth, the truth I have spent 15 years assembling the honesty to admit, is that I had stopped being willing to work rural night shifts in Crawford County. I had stopped being willing to take a cruiser down a 2-track in the National Forest after 10 o'clock and sweep a spotlight across the tree line and see what the tree line gave back. I had spent 22 years being the person who went toward the thing in the dark rather than away from it, and that capacity had been altered in a specific and irreversible way by 40 seconds on a logging road in October of 2009. I have read what I could find about other people's experiences, doing it carefully and without advertising what I was looking for or why. The accounts I found that felt genuine to me, not the theatrical ones, not the ones built for attention, but the ones written or told in the flat and slightly stunned register of people describing something they hadn't gone looking for and hadn't wanted, those accounts described the same things in the same order. The absence of animals before it appeared. The quality of the silence it made around itself, the smell, the eyes at the wrong height, the stillness that communicated intelligence rather than fear, the sense, afterward, that something had made a decision about you, had evaluated you and arrived at a conclusion, and that you had no way of knowing what that conclusion was. That last part is the thing that has stayed with me most consistently across 15 years, not the fear of the moment itself, which was acute and overwhelming and has faded into something more manageable with time, but the not knowing what it decided. The understanding that something out there in the Michigan forest assessed me through a cruiser windshield on a cold October night and made some kind of determination, and that I was not present for that determination and had no input into it and will never know what it was. Keith Dabrowski lives in Traverse City now, as far as I know. I heard he took up woodworking in his retirement, which sounds like him, sounds like the kind of man he was, someone who would find steadiness in making things with his hands. I hope it's given him that. I hope he sleeps better than I do. I have never contacted him to ask, because contacting him would mean acknowledging what we both know, and I think we have both arrived at the same understanding about what acknowledgement costs versus what continued silence costs, and we have both decided, separately and without discussing it, that the silence is the cheaper of the two options. I may have decided that incorrectly. I'm reconsidering it now. That's partly why I'm telling this story. Not to convince anyone of anything, not to make a case for what I think was standing at the tree line on that 2-track, because I don't think the case needs to be made by me, and I don't think the people who most need convincing are reachable by anything I could say. I'm telling it because I carried it alone for a long time, and the weight of it has taught me something about the cost of carrying things alone, and because there may be someone who has been in a similar position who has seen something on a road or in a forest or at the edge of a clearing that their training and their experience and their reasonable mind could not account for, and who has been carrying that alone too. To that person, I want to say only this: what you saw was real. The silence that followed was real. And you are not the first person to have come out of the Michigan woods at night with something behind your eyes that wasn't there before you went in. I don't go into the national forest anymore. I don't work night shifts of any kind. I live a quiet and mostly ordinary life, and I am grateful for it in a way that I probably wouldn't have been capable of before that October night, which is perhaps the only thing that experience gave me that I can call a gift without qualification. My wife knows something happened out there. She has known for 15 years without asking me to explain it, which is its own kind of grace. Bess died 3 years ago, and the yard is quieter at night without her. I've not gotten another dog. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because I'm not certain I want to know what another dog would find to stare at through the sliding glass door in the 3 o'clock hour, standing at the threshold between the lit kitchen and the dark yard, looking at something out past the fence that I cannot see, and that she, with everything her senses were built for, has decided she will not go toward.